Hi guys, and welcome to lecture video number 10 of our series on Unit 3, America's Revolution in the Early Republic from 1754 to 1800. So this is kind of the second part of our two-part mini-series on 3.10, Shaping a New Republic, in which we're really going to talk about a lot of the domestic and international concerns and challenges that are really facing the United States in the 1790s. Okay, so first of all, how did the United States deal with foreign diplomacy challenges that were facing them? So a couple of things to talk about here. There's some international concerns over both Britain and Spain. So the relationship with Britain was understandably tense, not just because of the Revolutionary War and the breakaway from Britain, but also because Britain continued to seize American ships and impress American sailors. Now, you may recall that this was a practice that the British did when the American colonies were still colonies and part of Great Britain. Impressment was when the Navy would literally just say any of the British citizens could be taken and impressed into the Navy and forced to serve in the Navy for as long as the British felt that they wanted them. And they could take any sailors off of any British ships. And since the American colonies, of course, at the time were British, then that's what happened. And this was really frustrating to the American colonists and part of the reason, one of the contributing factors to the American Revolution. Now, fun fact, the British kept doing this. So even after Americans were no longer British, they were still doing this, and it was causing a lot of very tense relationships between them. You may also recall that in our a couple of videos we talked about the fact that the British still refused to abandon forts in the Northwest Territory. So this was also an issue. So this was a real problem because American sailors that were going to France were becoming impressed by the British Navy, and this was partially happening because Britain was near to war with France over the French Revolution. Now, Hamilton felt that what was really important to pursue a solid relationship with Britain. Hamilton envisioned the nation as just busily engaged with trade, and Britain was the closest possible trade ally. I mean, remember, they still controlled Canada. So it was really important for Hamilton and others in the government that we would maintain this really good relationship with Britain. Washington, on the other hand, was just very cognizant of the fact that the new United States was still weak. It was fledgling, it was new, it was fragile. It was facing a lot of challenges. And at this point, he really didn't want to risk a second war with Britain. To this end, in 1793, Washington appoints Chief Justice John Jay to treat with the British and create what becomes known as Jay's Treaty. So essentially, John Jay got the British to agree to give up the posts on the American frontier. This made the Spanish very nervous because Britain was their enemy, and the Spanish started to get real concerned about their own territory and how that might fare with a close relation between Britain and the United States. Now, John Jay was successful in getting the British to give up those posts on the American frontier. However, he was not actually very successful at getting them to agree to end impressment. That tradition still often continued on. Jefferson and Madison hated this treaty. Democrat and Republicans hated this. They were very supportive of France during the French Revolution. They really disliked Britain, and they felt like it was a terrible idea to treat with Britain. So the Democratic Republicans were very opposed to this. Also, as a result of Jay's Treaty, Spain begins to expand their mission settlements in North America, trying to consolidate their territory. This includes moving into California, hoping to consolidate their hold on other territory. Eventually, this is going to lead in a couple of years to something called Pinckney's Treaty in 1795. Essentially, the Mississippi River, the use of the Mississippi River was kind of under contention. The U.S. still wanted to use it to be able to trade. But of course, the Mississippi River emptied out in Louisiana territory, which at the time was controlled by Spain. So Pinckney's Treaty allowed Americans to use the port at New Orleans to trade along the Mississippi River. And it also agreed on the official boundary between the southern border of the United States and Spanish territory, and that would fall on the 31st parallel. Okay, another big concern is the French Revolution. So you may recall from world history last year, if you had it, the French Revolution occurred not long after America's own revolution, breaking out in 1789. So now the question then becomes, should the U.S. government support the French in their own war, just as the French supported them in the American Revolution? But of course, the tricky part here is the French Revolution turned on its own monarch. And of course, it was the monarch of France who sent support to the Americans during their revolution. So even though a lot of the players in the French Revolution were people who had come and helped with the American Revolution, there was this question of, should we actually be supporting this? Many did want to support the French in the Revolution as they had been supported. The idea of overthrowing a monarch in favor of a republic was very appealing to them. However, France's revolution, you may recall, takes a pretty distinct left turn in 1791 with the Reign of Terror. The original people who had begun the revolution are actually kind of turned on by the revolution itself. And France really becomes a sort of battleground of these very commoners against the nobility or anybody perceived to be nobility. And they really turn on itself, attack their own former leaders. They behead their king and queen, which is really difficult because then, other countries, European countries, begin to declare war on them. France declares war on others. So France, by the 1790s, is embroiled in territorial wars with much of Europe. So this really raises the question about how wise it is to actually support the French Revolution. So Americans and Washington's cabinet were divided over this question of whether or not to support them. Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans, generally wanted to support them. They felt that republics should be encouraged and the French had aided us. And of course, Thomas Jefferson is the one in charge of foreign affairs. On the other hand, Alexander Hamilton really opposed the French Revolution, as did other Federalists, because they saw it as dangerous. Remember, the Federalists were fairly elite, and they thought the power should stay with the hands of people who had money. So while they weren't opposed to a republic in France, they were really opposed with the dangerous direction they saw the revolution going, which had actually turned on the originators of the French Revolution. Those who were kind of middle upper class men with property had actually been turned on during the Reign of Terror. So they were really concerned about this being too dangerous. I mean, remember, the Federalists were actually quite conservative in wanting to maintain sort of the status quo. They were also really concerned because they wanted to keep U.S. on track economically. And as we saw at Jay's Treaty, Britain became a very important trade partner, and France had declared war on Britain. So that was a real concern. And ultimately, Washington is going to issue his proclamation of neutrality in 1793. Washington, for some of the same reasons we mentioned about Jay's Treaty, is going to realize that keeping the U.S. a new nation out of war is the best thing that could possibly happen. This decision leads to an overall policy. Again, Washington is setting precedents that will follow for a long time, leads to an overall policy of neutrality in European affairs. And this mostly holds sway until about World War I. Okay, so this is a pretty strong precedent he sets here. The goal of Washington was to protect this kind of vulnerable new nation and make sure we didn't get deeply involved in European wars. And again, like I said, kind of in the last video, this is going to contribute to a growing divide between the cabinet and the public, and those within the cabinet as well, those within the government. So domestic challenges. How did the United States deal with the domestic challenges that we're facing them? There's a couple domestic challenges. One of them is westward migration. Westward migration into Ohio River Valley, unsurprisingly, begins to cause conflict with Native Americans who also occupy that land. The Americans may have viewed it as British land, French land that became British land that became American land. The Native Americans, unsurprisingly, saw it differently. They saw it as their land. So there were a lot of rumors circulating the British were supplying Native Americans with weapons to fight against American colonists, American settlers moving into this area. And that probably was true. Entirely possible. You may recall that the British had also fought a pretty significant war in this region called Pontiac's War in the 1760s, which, while the British won, it fundamentally changed how they dealt with Native Americans, realizing that, hey, maybe it's not a good idea to try to force settlers into these areas. It'll lead to war. War is expensive. We're not going to do that. So by the 1790s, we're going to start to see real clashes occurring. Again, we have pan-Indian alliances that are fighting against the U.S. Army, and this really culminates in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Okay, so the war that this battle was a part of, the Pan-Indian Alliance was fairly successful, at least in a few battles. Ultimately, in 1794, they lose this battle against the U.S. Army. The Native Americans do, and eventually, most of the American Indians are going to be forced to surrender all the lands in Ohio, the Ohio River Valley. And that really does help to open that area up to settlement. And we're going to talk a lot more in the next unit about the relationship between Native Americans and the U.S. government. Okay, a couple other issues. The Whiskey Rebellion. This is a really big one, and I kind of hinted at this one earlier. But you may recall in the last video that Hamilton had convinced Congress to pass a tax on a number of luxury goods, including whiskey. Now, this is a problem because a lot of Western farmers, okay, people on the Appalachian Mountains or further west, many of them who are grain farmers found it much cheaper to actually take their grain and distill it into whiskey rather than actually kind of haul that grain across land for Eastern markets. So it was actually a lot cheaper to distill it down into whiskey, which was, of course, worth a lot more money and easier to move because it was distilled and smaller. So a lot of Western farmers saw this as a direct attack on them. It really started to create this divide between Western interests and Eastern interests, between country, rural interests, and city interests. Okay, as I said in the last video, Hamilton saw this as key to raising the money needed to essentially fund the Treasury and fund the National Bank and encourage the growth of manufacturing and industry and business growth. And of course, this was pretty antithetical to the interests of Western farmers. So Western farmers were pretty upset. As far back as 1791, they were attacking in Pennsylvania. They were attacking tax collectors and tarring and feathering them, which basically meant for the next 2 years, tax collection went way down in Pennsylvania. This is going to come to a head in 1794 when Pennsylvania's farmers start to actually make renewed attack on the tax collectors. Now, this is rather like Shays' Rebellion, and we've got a new government, so it's our real first test of, hey, will the Constitution hold up better than the Articles of Confederation? So what's going to happen is Washington himself will actually ride out. He actually sends a few men first to negotiate, but they absolutely refuse to negotiate with the delegates he sent. So he rides out with the 13th Army, with an army of 13,000, and he becomes the only sitting president to ever enter a field of battle with his troops, although he quickly gave up the command to another commander. But he helps put down this rebellion with the U.S. Army. And then he proves, hey, look at that. With the Constitution, it is possible for the United States to deal with crises, as opposed to what happened under Shays' Rebellion, which you recall Boston merchants had to basically pay to raise a state militia. So it proves that it's possible. Now, a number of men were attacked. Hamilton encourages the trial of a number of men who are supposed to be ringleaders. Most of them are eventually pardoned or don't go to trial because of lack of evidence. So it also shows that the new United States could kind of be merciful and understanding. But it really demonstrated the fact that A, the Constitution could deal with these new crises, and B, that not everyone liked the new government. Like Western farmers had proved really clearly they did not like a lot of the new processes of the new United States government. Thomas Jefferson hated this, by the way. He heavily criticized the actions of the U.S. government here because you'll recall Jefferson, as a Democratic Republican, didn't believe that the whiskey tax should exist in the first place. He didn't feel that people should be taxed for that. So he was pretty upset with that. Remember, he believed strongly in states' rights to tax as opposed to national government. So he really heavily criticized the actions of the U.S. government here. Okay, what challenges arose after the transition of power from Washington to Adams? So in 1796, Washington steps down, shocking the nation. Look, he willingly stepped down after 2 terms. The fact that he stepped down after 2 terms did a couple of things. Number one, it set a precedent that presidents should not serve more than 2 terms. It wasn't a law until the 20th century. He set a precedent, and everyone followed that precedent until World War II, the Great Depression, and FDR, who was elected for 4 terms. And after that, it does become law for 2 terms to be the maximum. But he stepped down after 2 terms, and it demonstrates that, hey, he's not a king. A peaceful transfer of power is possible. He gave a farewell speech in which he warned really strongly against the danger of political parties and factions, which was obviously already a big issue. Thank you, Hamilton and Jefferson. We already have these 2 strong factions emerging. He also warned against permanent alliances with foreign nations, especially Europe. Basically, he said, stay out of Europe's nonsense. We're a whole ocean away from them. We don't have to be involved. Stay out of it. Don't make military and diplomatic permanent alliances with European nations that's going to draw you into war. And don't form factions, political parties that's going to just divide the government, stymie it, make it impossible for them to move anything forward. John Adams becomes the 2nd president. He was Washington's vice president. John Adams was a Federalist. He was pro-British. He agreed with Hamilton on many matters. Right after John Adams becomes president, war breaks out between Britain and France, proving this to be an exceptionally difficult term for John Adams. Now, John Adams said the U.S. would remain neutral, just as Washington had originally decided. But France was causing problems now. France began to seize trade ships and go after that were going to Britain. Okay, you recall, because of Jay's Treaty, Britain was becoming a close trade ally with the United States, and France began to seize those trade ships that were going to Britain and supplying Britain. And this, of course, is going to cause some real tension between France and the United States. So this leads to the XYZ affair. The XYZ affair was when Adams sent delegates to France to negotiate over this, basically to create some kind of treaty that would stop France from, taking over U.S. merchant ships. So he sent delegates to France to negotiate, but the French agents absolutely just insulted the American agents, saying as soon as they got there, immediately demanded a bribe from the American agents before they would even begin to negotiate. This enraged Americans. Now, the French agents were known only as X, Y, and Z in the public accounts, which is why this is called the XYZ affair. Both Federalists and Democratic Republicans are pretty angry about this, and ultimately it actually leads to this French quasi-war that isn't a true war, but sort of fought on the sea between French and American merchant ships. And the quasi-war really leads to major concerns about foreign agents acting in the U.S. and threatening America's neutrality. So Adams pushes Congress to pass these two acts called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, these were intended to act against French sympathizers, but also worked functionally to silence those who were critical of the government. So the Alien Act allowed the government to imprison or deport any non-citizen they wanted to. It was aimed at critical Irish and Scottish immigrants who didn't like pro-British leanings. And even though they didn't actually deport anyone, it really convinced a lot of foreign nationals to leave on their own. And then more controversially was the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act made it illegal to publicly criticize the government. And really this tested what the Constitution meant in the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, when they said freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Now, the government with the Sedition Act argues, look, all of this means, freedom of speech, is that we're not going to censor you. It doesn't mean you're free from punishment for the things you say. We have a right to punish you. But this really enrages Democratic Republicans, because what actually ends up happening is they go after two Republican printers and arrest them, Democratic Republican printers who were criticizing the government, the Federalist government. Adams was a Federalist. And they even arrested one Democratic Republican senator. And the Democratic Republicans were obviously angry about this. They saw it as a massive overreach of federal power and a violation of the Constitution. They argued that no, they had this expanded notion of freedom of speech, that not only did you have the right to say whatever you want, but you had the right not to be punished for it. So this is actually an expansion of what perhaps was originally intended with freedom of speech. The response to the Sedition Act was the passage of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, both passed in 1798. The Kentucky and Virginia both passed resolutions that basically said, you know what, states have a right to nullify any law that's passed by the federal government that they felt was unconstitutional, that went beyond the powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. Now, this is a rather bold and dangerous claim. The idea that a state could nullify a law passed by the federal government, this directly violates the idea of the Supremacy Clause, that when the federal government and state government laws contradict each other, federal government laws are supreme. Now, at the time, all this was a really bold claim. There wasn't a lot of action on it. But later on, this is really going to form the basis for a pretty big crisis with the South in the 1830s. So thanks to the XYZ affair and the Alien and Sedition Acts, Adams is not popular and is not reelected. He serves only one term. He's not reelected in 1800, and Jefferson becomes president. This is sometimes called the Revolution of 1800 because it represents the first time we see a transition of power from one political party to another. And it works. There's no war. We see this peaceful transition of power. This is why it's sometimes called the Revolution of 1800. And we're going to get more into Jeffersonian politics in the next unit. Okay, so we'll be back with that next time.